In the winter of 1887, a single photograph arrived at the Charleston courthouse that would haunt investigators for decades. It showed 17 children, ages 3 to 16, standing barefoot in the snow outside a ramshackle cabin in the remote hollows of West Virginia. What made this image disturbing wasn't just their skeletal frames or hollow eyes. It was the iron shackles visible around their ankles, and the fact that, according to official records, the Greylock family of Bone Creek Hollow had reported only 4 children living in their home. The remaining 13 had been systematically erased from all documentation, their births never recorded, their existence denied by every adult in the isolated mountain community. Before we continue with the story of the Greylock family and their unspeakable crimes hidden deep in the Appalachian wilderness, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the darkest true stories that history tried to bury. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Let's see how far these forgotten American horror stories reach. The photograph that started it all was just the beginning of a mystery that would expose one of the most systematic cases of child exploitation in American history, buried beneath generations of mountain silence and complicity. Bone Creek Hollow carved itself deep into the West Virginia mountains like a scar that never healed. In 1887, this remote valley existed in a world unto itself, cut off from civilization by treacherous mountain passes that became impassable during the brutal Appalachian winters. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 27 miles through winding deer paths that could swallow a man whole if he didn't know the mountain secrets. Here, in this forgotten pocket of America, families had lived by their own rules for generations, bound by blood, silence, and an unspoken understanding that what happened in the hollow stayed in the hollow. The Greylock family had claimed the valley's most fertile bottomland in 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock led his wife and 6 children through the Cumberland Gap during the Great Westward Migration. Unlike other families who sought fortune in gold or fertile plains, Jeremiah Greylock had different ambitions. He understood that isolation bred opportunity for those willing to operate outside society's watchful eye. The hollow provided everything he needed: fresh water from Bone Creek, rich soil for crops, dense forests for hunting, and most importantly, complete separation from government interference, church oversight, or curious neighbors. By 1887, 3 generations of Greylocks had transformed their mountain retreat into something far more complex than a simple homestead. Ezekiel Greylock, Jeremiah's grandson, controlled not just his own family, but an intricate network of relatives, hired hands, and what local records euphemistically called wards, children whose origins nobody questioned and whose welfare nobody monitored. The hollow had become a self-contained world where Ezekiel's word was law, his justice absolute, and his methods of maintaining order both creative and terrifying. Ezekiel himself was a man shaped by the harsh mountain environment. Tall and lean as a hickory sapling, with eyes the color of winter ice, he possessed an intelligence that many underestimated due to his backwoods dialect and patched clothing. But behind that carefully cultivated rustic facade was a calculating mind that had spent decades perfecting a system of control that would have impressed the most ruthless plantation overseer. His wife, Martha Greylock, born Martha Kellerman from a neighboring hollow, had been shaped by 30 years of mountain isolation into something as hard and unforgiving as the stone peaks that surrounded their home. The Greylock children, at least the 4 officially recognized ones, reflected their parents' harsh philosophy. Samuel, the eldest at 19, had inherited his father's cold intelligence and cruel creativity. Rebecca, 17, possessed a quiet viciousness that manifested in small acts of calculated cruelty. The younger twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, barely 14, had already learned that survival in their family meant absolute obedience to their father's increasingly bizarre demands and complete silence about what they witnessed in their isolated world. But these four represented only the visible tip of a much larger and more disturbing reality. The Greylock family's true power came from their ability to acquire and control children whose disappearances would never be investigated, whose screams would never be heard beyond the mountain walls, and whose labor would never be compensated. In an era when child mortality rates were high, record-keeping was sporadic, and communication between remote communities was nearly non-existent. The Greylocks had discovered they could operate their own private kingdom with complete impunity. The method of acquisition was both simple and diabolical. During harsh winters, desperate families from surrounding hollows would sometimes approach Ezekiel with offers to bind out their children. A common practice where families struggling to survive would send children to work for better established households in exchange for food, shelter, and supposed education. However, once these children crossed the threshold into Bone Creek Hollow, they entered a world where legal protections meant nothing, where their original families were told they had moved on to opportunities in the big towns, and where their new reality was closer to slavery. Other children arrived through even darker channels. Orphans from failed homesteads, abandoned infants left at remote churches, children whose parents had died in mining accidents or from the diseases that regularly swept through Appalachian communities. All found their way to the Greylock family through a network of corrupt county officials, unscrupulous traveling preachers, and opportunistic neighbors who received small payments for their silence and cooperation. By winter of 1887, this system had been operating successfully for over 2 decades. The official Greylock household consisted of 6 people, but the reality was a carefully orchestrated community of 21 souls, 17 of whom existed in a shadow world of backbreaking labor, inadequate food, and systematic brutality that would have shocked even the most hardened observers of that harsh era. The photograph that would eventually expose the Greylock family's crimes was never intended to serve as evidence. In December 1887, a traveling photographer named Henry Pemberton had been making his way through the mountain communities, offering to capture family portraits for the unusually reasonable price of 50 cents per sitting. For isolated families who might never see another photographer, this represented a precious opportunity to document their lives for posterity. Pemberton had heard about the Greylocks during his stay in Cedar Ridge. Local merchants spoke of the family with a mixture of respect and wariness, describing Ezekiel as a man who always paid his debts in cash and who seemed to produce an unusual amount of crops and preserved goods for trade, despite the harsh conditions of his isolated hollow. Intrigued by stories of the family's prosperity and hoping for a substantial commission, Pemberton had made the difficult journey to Bone Creek Hollow on December 15, 1887. What he found there challenged every assumption he had made about backwoods mountain families. The Greylock homestead was not the rough log cabin he had expected, but a complex of well-constructed buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main house, built from expertly hewn chestnut logs, featured multiple rooms, glass windows, and a stone chimney that spoke of permanent prosperity. Surrounding it were a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, workshops for various crafts, and what appeared to be dormitory-style structures that seemed oddly institutional for a family dwelling. But it was the children that first struck Pemberton as unusual. When he arrived, Ezekiel had proudly introduced his 4 official children, each dressed in clean, well-maintained clothing and displaying the kind of respectful demeanor that spoke of strict discipline. However, as Pemberton set up his equipment in the central courtyard, he began to notice other children moving in the shadows between buildings, thin figures who seemed to melt away whenever he looked directly at them, children whose clothing was patched and worn, whose movements carried a furtive quality that spoke of constant vigilance. When Pemberton mentioned these other children to Ezekiel, the mountain patriarch's explanation was smooth and reasonable. Orphans the family had taken in out of Christian charity, distant relatives who helped with the seasonal work. All perfectly normal for a large homestead in the remote mountains, where extended family networks and informal adoptions were common survival strategies. But as Pemberton prepared to take the family portrait, something happened that shattered the carefully maintained facade. A commotion erupted from one of the outlying buildings, the sound of running feet, shouting voices, and what sounded distinctly like chains rattling. Several of the shadow children suddenly burst into the courtyard, and for the first time, Pemberton got a clear look at them. These were not the healthy, well-fed relatives or hired hands children that Ezekiel had described. These were skeletal figures with hollow eyes, wearing patched clothing that hung from their frames like burial shrouds. And around their ankles, clearly visible in the winter sunlight, were iron shackles connected by short lengths of chain that allowed them to walk, but prevented any possibility of running. The scene that followed burned itself into Pemberton's memory with photographic clarity. Martha Greylock screamed at the children in a voice that carried decades of practiced cruelty. Samuel and Rebecca moved with swift efficiency to round up the escapees, wielding leather straps with the casual expertise of long practice. Ezekiel's mask of civilized hospitality slipped away entirely, revealing something cold and calculating as he began issuing rapid orders about securing the workers and maintaining discipline. In that moment of chaos and revealed truth, Pemberton's professional instincts overcame his shock. His camera was already prepared for the family portrait, and almost without conscious thought, he triggered the shutter. The resulting image captured 17 children standing in the snow outside the main house, their shackles clearly visible, their faces bearing expressions of hopelessness and terror that no amount of time could erase from his memory. The aftermath was swift and terrifying. Ezekiel immediately realized what had happened and demanded the photographic plate. But Pemberton, sensing that he had documented something of terrible importance, claimed the exposure had failed and that he would need to prepare a new plate. This bought him precious time to secretly prepare a second plate with the incriminating image while pretending to set up for a retake. When he finally produced a successful family portrait showing only the 4 official Greylock children arranged in conventional poses, Ezekiel seemed satisfied that the evidence of his crimes had been contained. Pemberton left Bone Creek Hollow that evening carrying 2 photographic plates, one showing the respectable Greylock family as they wanted to be remembered, and another showing a truth so horrifying that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The photographer's hands shook as he developed the plates in his hotel room in Cedar Ridge 3 days later. The image of those 17 shackled children seemed to stare back at him from the photographic paper, their silent suffering demanding justice that he was not sure how to provide. In an era when photography was still regarded with suspicion in many rural areas, when legal protections for children were minimal, and when the word of respectable white landowners carried enormous weight against the testimony of an outsider, Pemberton faced a terrible choice: remain silent and live with his conscience, or risk everything to expose crimes that most people would find easier to disbelieve than confront. Henry Pemberton's decision to act on what he had witnessed in Bone Creek Hollow was neither immediate nor simple. For 3 weeks after his return to Charleston, the photographer found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had discovered and the potential consequences of exposing it. The photograph sat in his studio safe, its existence known only to him, while he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. In 1888 West Virginia, the legal system was not equipped to handle crimes of this nature, particularly when they involved established landowners in remote areas. Child labor was common and largely unregulated. Informal adoptions and apprenticeships were normal practices. The line between harsh discipline and criminal abuse was often a matter of local custom rather than legal statute. More troubling still, Pemberton had begun to understand through careful inquiries that the Greylock family's influence extended far beyond their isolated hollow. When he finally approached local authorities in Charleston, his reception was mixed and frustrating. The county sheriff, James Rutledge, listened to Pemberton's account with skeptical attention, but pointed out the practical difficulties of investigating claims against a family living in such remote terrain. More concerning was Rutledge's obvious familiarity with Ezekiel Greylock's name and his reluctance to discuss details of that familiarity. When pressed, the sheriff finally admitted that Greylock had been helpful to law enforcement on several occasions and was regarded as a reliable source of information about criminal activity in the mountain regions. This revelation opened up disturbing new questions about the scope of the Greylock operation. Through patient investigation over the following months, Pemberton began to uncover a network of relationships that suggested the crimes in Bone Creek Hollow were part of a much larger system of corruption and exploitation. Court records from surrounding counties revealed